Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 493. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. We got quite a bit to get through on today's show, so I'm going to jump right into it. Just want to remind people that they could share the show. You find it at YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version. It's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. I repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com, and you can always find the show at my social media. YouTube, Twitter is Kyle Anzalone _. The show is at con_interest. On Facebook, I will post the show. I'm just Kyle Anzalone. You can find me on there. And then on Instagram, I'm Kyle Anzalone 3. Now let's get into the news today. First up here, Antony Blinken, our Secretary of State, says U.S. needs to fund wars in Ukraine and Gaza because of China. And for anybody who just looks at a map, they might be really confused about that. But Antony Blinken has some twisted logic that he's going to try to throw on us here. So the Biden administration officials are arguing that the U.S. needs to fund the wars in Ukraine and Gaza to send a message to China in their pitch to Congress to authorize a massive $105 billion spending package that includes military aid for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. What happens in Ukraine, what happens in the Middle East also matters for the Indo-Pacific. Beyond Europe, we know our allies as well as our adversaries as well as our competitors are watching that conflict. They know we are watching our response. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said at a Senate Appropriations Committee hearing on Tuesday, according to the South China Morning Post. So the funding request is vital to secure a free and open Indo-Pacific in the face of mounting challenges in that region, Blinken added. The hearing came after Republicans in both the House and Senate introduced bills for separate military aid for Israel apart from the other issues. And so, this is really backwards, what Blinken is saying here. And so, if you look at history, empires stretch themselves too thin, and that's a part of the reason they face downfalls and collapse. And so, honestly, looking at what would be the priority, you should allocate your resources to that. But Blinken believes that if you show any weakness anywhere, then everybody is going to just invade and violate everything and step all over democracies all over the world. This is the worldview that Blinken has. And so, like I said, it's completely backwards, and it's very, very frail logic to try to convince Congress to pass a massive $105 billion bill. But that's what they're saying here. So the $105 billion request, by the way, includes $7.4 billion in advanced administrative strategies against China in the Asia Pacific, including over $3 billion to finance submarine construction, $2 billion in assistance for regional countries, and $2 billion in military aid. It's not clear if the $2 billion in military aid is exclusively for Taiwan. There was a statement by White House officials who said no, but there still hasn't been any detailed clarity around that. So we also had Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin making a similar argument, saying that China would like to see the United States be unsuccessful. They would like to see Russia continue to challenge us and to keep us focused on that area so we have less time, energy, and resources. And so, of course, if that's your concern, having less time, energy, and resources, you don't have to focus on Ukraine. There's nothing in the American Constitution. There's nothing in the job description of the Secretary of State. There's no real American interest in Ukraine. And so we don't have to focus on Ukraine. That is a choice that the American empire is making, right? And so to redirect those resources to China, if that's your great concern, that would seemingly be the best military strategy. But they're saying, no, what we actually have to do is commit more resources to Ukraine and to Israel. Again, even though Israel is fighting an Islamist group in a besieged enclave that, its military capabilities are fairly limited, particularly compared to Israel. And we already give Israel $4 billion a year in military aid. So, there's really no reason that the U.S. should feel they have to transfer this to Ukraine. Yes, a lot of that aid going to Israel is for air defense interceptors, which, Israel probably needs a lot of. However, not sending those interceptors to Ukraine may force Tel Aviv to choose a policy in pursuing Hamas and the people who carried out the attack inside of Israel in a way that doesn't kill a massive amount of civilians as they have been doing, and forces them to take a more tactical and smaller approach. But instead, we're giving them all the interceptors. That way, Israel could just slaughter Palestinians at will, and then if anybody objects, they have all the missile defense capabilities to shoot those down. So, we've seen the Houthis, we've seen Hezbollah in Lebanon, and also Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza itself, fire rockets into Israel. And there, certainly may be less support for those kind of moves by the Palestinians and things like that if Israel was taking a more limited and a less heavy-handed approach inside of Gaza. But we will talk more about that as we go through the show. All right, so next up, one more story on China here. They say U.S. says Chinese jet came within 10 feet of U.S. B-52 bomber over the South China Sea. The U.S. military is accusing Chinese fighter jets of making an unsafe intercept of a U.S. B-52 bomber that was flying over the South China Sea on October 24th. U.S. Indo-Pacific Command said in a statement that the Chinese jet came within 10 feet of the American bomber. We are concerned that the pilot was unaware how close it came to causing a collision, the command said. According to the Associated Press, the U.S. did not answer questions about what the B-52 was doing flying over the sensitive waters, but framed the flight as a routine operation. It is also unclear of how close the bomber was to mainland China. China did not confirm the details of the U.S. account of the incident, but said it blames the tensions in the region on the U.S. The U.S. military aircraft would traveled halfway around the world to China's doorstep to show off American military muscle is exactly the source of maritime and air security risks and dangers to regional peace and stability. China will take resolute measures to safeguard its sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Mao Ning said. So, this is really important, where the U.S. gets so upset that China has an unsafe intercept of an American bomber, but all these intercepts are occurring in the South China Sea, certainly in waters and territory claimed by China, and China does have some pretty ambitious territorial claims in the South China Sea, and so these planes flying over the Spratly Islands are probably somewhat less contentious than flying closer to the Chinese coastline, but still if anything like this was happening in waters off of America and we were flying our fighter jets within 10 feet of the Chinese bomber and the Chinese were complaining about that, I think Americans would be like, hell yeah, and next time we might even shoot the bomber down, not just condemning the Chinese for doing this. So, you always got to look at how people would react if the shoe was on the other foot. And certainly in this case, the Americans would be very upset. All right, now let's move on to talk about some news from Ukraine. We have probably about a week's worth of news to get through here. Haven't talked about this since, I believe, middle of last week's show. So Zelinsky deludes himself into thinking Ukraine can win war, and that is something that his aide said to Time magazine. So one of Ukrainian President Zelinsky's closest aide has told Time magazine that the Ukrainian leader has deluded himself into thinking Ukraine can win an ultimate victory against Russia after the failed counteroffensive and amid waning support for the conflict in the West. The report says that despite the setbacks, Zelinsky does not intend to give up fighting or to sue for any kind of peace. On the contrary, his belief in Ukraine's ultimate victory over Russia has hardened into a form that worries some of his advisors. It's immovable, verging on messianic. According to the aide, Zelinsky deludes himself, adding, "We're out of options. We're not winning," but try telling him that. The report said that the idea of negotiating for peace or a temporary truce with Russia remains taboo to Zelinsky. For us, it would mean leaving this wound open for future generations. Maybe it can it will calm down for some inside our country and outside, at least for those who want to wrap things up at any price. But for me, that's a problem because we are left with this explosive force. We're only delaying its detonation. A senior Ukrainian, and that was a statement from Zelinsky. A senior Ukrainian military officer told the magazine that the armed forces has had to second guess orders that came from Kiev's political leadership, including an order to capture the Donetsk city of Horlikia. They don't have the men or the weapons, the officer said. Where are the weapons? Where's the artillery? Where are the new recruits? Ukraine isn't just running low on weapons, but also low on manpower. One of Zelensky's aides said that even if Ukraine's Western backers supplied all the arms they needed, we don't have the men to use them, he said. The report also details the corruption in Ukraine's government that led to Zelensky's recent sack of the outgoing defense minister, Reznikov, and the author of the Times story, Simon Schuster, said that he naively thought Ukrainian officials would think twice before taking him alive, but an advisor to Zelinsky told him otherwise. Simon, you are mistaken, the advisor said. People are stealing like there is no tomorrow. So I'm sure for everybody in my audience, they feel like, of course, we knew this all along. This was obviously what was going on in Ukraine. Zelinsky was never going to win this war, even though he thought he could. And this was going to get a lot of Ukrainian people killed. And ultimately, Russia would prevail. And now the Ukrainian government has set these standards that say that, we have to win this ultimate victory. We had to take Crimea. We had to retake the Donbass. That's not going to happen. So rather than getting more realistic, the government has gotten more dogmatic. But with that at the top, that doesn't necessarily mean all the advisors underneath necessarily believe that. They see the writing on the wall. And so now they're just stealing everything they can because, get what you can and get out of town before the whole thing ends up blowing up. So let's now talk about some of the fighting going on in Ukraine. Russian forces pushing to encircle Eastern Ukrainian city of Advikia. Russian forces are pushing to circle Advikia, a city in eastern Ukraine's Donetsk Oblast that is about 3 miles north of the provincial capital, as fighting continues to rage along the entire front. The Washington Post on Sunday reported that Russian forces had advanced to the north of the city in recent days, according to South Front, which publishes daily maps of the battle situation in Ukraine. Russian forces are also making advances on the south of the city. And just really quickly, anybody who is watching the video version here, you can see kind of the territorial gains that Russia has made. A vague U shape is now formed around the city of Russian control of forces. So the pre-war population of the city was 32,000. That has shrunk to just over 1,000 now. According to the Post, the remaining residents in the city are living underground and relying on aid. The city is about 3 miles north of the Donetsk capital, which Russian forces will be in a better position to capture if they retake this city. Ukraine is claiming that Russia is taking heavy casualties in the battle. The White House has backed the claim, but also acknowledged that Moscow may achieve some tactical success in the coming months. I've also seen statements from Ukrainian officials saying this is starting to resemble Bakhmut, where we now know that maybe even causing this caused a delay in the summer counteroffensive, that Zelinsky committed so many forces to the Battle of Bakhmut that he didn't have the troops and equipment ready needed when the summer counteroffensive, or was supposed to be a spring counteroffensive, was ready to go. It didn't kick off until June 4th, and then they fought all summer long, and so in that time, between when they, I think, had hoped to start that counteroffensive, Russia really reinforced their positions, their defenses, their minefields, in part because everybody was saying that the counteroffensive was going to happen in the south. So, Russia, I'm sure, was able to figure out where the attack was likely going to come and was, able to build up massive lines of defense, and they only were able to penetrate maybe the first line of the Russian defenses in the south of Ukraine during that summer counteroffensive. So far this year, Russia has taken more Ukrainian territory than Ukraine, Kiev's forces have retaken. So if this is resembling Bakhmut, that's probably not a good sign for Kiev and the Ukrainians. All right, next up here from Dave DeCamp, U.S. announces a $150 million weapons package for Ukraine. The Biden administration on Thursday announced a new weapons package for Ukraine worth $150 million. That includes ammunition for HIMARS, air defenses, artillery rounds, and other equipment. The weapons are being provided under the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which allows the U.S. to send weapons straight from Pentagon stockpiles. The $150 million is being pulled from funds that are made available by a Pentagon accounting error where they claim to overvalued previous weapons shipments sent to Ukraine. Earlier this month, the Pentagon said it still had $5.4 billion in drawdown funds available from the money freed up by the error. Based on the weapons packages that have been announced since then, the Pentagon has about $5 billion left to ship weapons to Ukraine until Congress needs to authorize more. So according to the Pentagon, their $150 million package includes additional munitions for National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems, AIM-9 missiles for air defenses, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, additional ammunition for HIMARS, 155mm and 105mm artillery rounds, TOW missiles, Javelin missiles, more than 2 million rounds of small arms, night vision, demolition munitions, cold weather gear, spare parts, maintenance, and other ancillary equipment. And according to the Pentagon, the U.S. has now committed $43.9 billion in military equipment for Ukraine since Russia invaded the country last year. We have an update on the training of Ukrainian pilots on F-16s. The U.S. started training Ukrainian pilots on F-16s in Arizona this week, marking another step towards arming Kiev with U.S.-made warplanes. An Air Force spokesperson told Air and Space Force magazine that a small number of Ukrainian pilots are training with the 162nd Wing of the Arizona National Guard in Tucson. The spokesperson did not give a definitive timeline on when the training will be completed, saying it will take several months. Foreign F-16 pilots also need to take English lessons, which Ukrainians started last month in Texas. When President Biden first approved the plan to arm Ukraine with F-16s earlier this year, it was sold as a European-led effort. Training classes started in Europe in August, but soon after, the Pentagon said it would also train Ukrainian pilots inside of the U.S. So far, the Netherlands and Denmark have pledged to give F-16s to Ukraine, but it will still take some time before they can be delivered to the battlefield. And just yesterday, I saw the Russian defense minister saying that it was very important or not very important, but that Russia assessed it could destroy all the F-16s within 20 days of them being delivered to Ukraine. I don't know if that's overly optimistic, but this is the kind of response we're getting from the Russians at this point. All right, so Russia to withdraw from ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Now, this sounds more provocative than it is because the U.S. was never a member of this treaty. So Dave writes here, Russia's upper house of parliament, the Federal Council, approved a bill on Wednesday to revoke the ratification. The lower house, the State Duma, approved the bill last week, and it now heads to Vladimir Putin's desk for signature. Russia ratified the CTBT in 2000, and Putin has said that revoking it would mirror U.S. policy. The U.S. and Russia are still participants in the 1963 Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which prohibits all nuclear tests except those performed underground. And then the comprehensive one, of course, also gets rid of the underground tests. But Since the end of the Cold War, the US and Russia haven't tested a nuclear weapon, and it doesn't seem like there's any plan to do so. The US never ratified the CTBT, and so, Russia says they're just moving their policy in line with the US. So at this point, I think the Russian position, as long as the US doesn't test a weapon, then they won't test a weapon. And while that seems like it could be, is a pretty clear standard that, one country would have to detonate a nuke before another country does, the U.S. is preparing to do something which they call tickling the dragon's tail, which is a crazy phrase for what I'm about to explain. But basically what they're going to try to do is do a detonate a nuclear weapon, but without setting off the nuclear chain reaction. So I guess making the explosion as big as possible before it becomes nuclear. And I mean, I would probably have to talk to, somebody that's a little bit more versed in how nuclear weapons work to bring you a more accurate description than that. But it's a subatomic explosion of a nuclear weapon, which sounds absolutely horrifying. And the U.S. is considering doing that. So let's hope it doesn't happen, but I think it will. All right, one more story here on Ukraine before we switch over to talking about Israel. NATO chief, Gaza war cannot interfere with support for Ukraine. The civilian leader of the North Atlantic Alliance condemned the Hamas attack on Israel, but emphasized that support for Tel Aviv must not encroach on aid for Ukraine. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg went on to warn Iran and Hezbollah against attacking Israel as Tel Aviv relentlessly bombs Gaza. Speaking to the Nordic Council in Oslo, Norway on Tuesday, Stoltenberg expressed military support for Kiev was the only way to achieve peace. A new winter is approaching, and we must expect new attacks against energy supplies and other critical infrastructure. There are no signs that Russia is planning for peace. On the contrary, they are planning for more war. Therefore, we must continue to support Ukraine. That means more weapons. And I say that because I want peace in Ukraine. And so, of course, it's completely ridiculous and is about as logical as Blinken's argument as to why we need to support the wars in Ukraine and Israel in order to support or in order to deter China from attacking Taiwan. But again, this is the logic that drives the empire's foreign policy at this point. Stoltenberg stressed that support for he says he stressed that support for Tel Aviv could not interfere with support for Kiev. He said the war in Gaza must not lead to a weakening of our will and ability to support Ukraine. The NATO chief went on to condemn the Hamas attack and issued a warning to Iran. It's important that this war does not escalate into a major regional conflict. Iran, Hezbollah, and other groups must not abuse the situation and escalate it further. Adding, the war in Ukraine must not lead to a weakening of all of our ability to support Ukraine. And so, this I think is important because, of course, it's really Israel that would have the ability to not escalate this conflict and that are abusing the situation to commit an ethnic cleansing campaign in Gaza. So, but of course, Stoltenberg has to echo, the support for Israel that's, prevalent among NATO members. So in Washington, President Joe Biden has pressed Congress to pass a $105 billion bill that includes $61.4 billion in assistance to Kiev, $14 billion in military aid for Israel, and billions of dollars in funds to build up military assets in the Asia Pacific. However, House Republicans are pushing to break up the bill. Speaker Mike Johnson plans to allow vote on legislation to fund Israel, but not Ukraine. And so I'm not, and by the way, I'm not saying that he's not going to allow a bill to come forward about supporting Ukraine. Just the immediate vote, the first bill, it only provides funds to Israel, not Ukraine. So on Monday, an article in Time magazine reported an aide to President Zelinsky said Kiev was facing a manpower shortage. She said if the West comes through on weapons deliveries, we don't have the men to use them. So, this is just interesting. Stoltenberg's pleading for weapons, but weapons may not be the issue. And of course, this would certainly suggest that the way to achieve peace here is to, negotiate and try to end this war, not continue to arm Ukraine. until the last Ukrainian is dead. All right, so let's move on and start talking about the conflict going on in Israel. First up here, day to camp, Israel told U.S. mass civilian casualties were acceptable price of Gaza campaign. During conversations with Israeli officials, it became clear to Biden administration that the Israeli government believed mass civilian casualties were an acceptable price of the bombing campaign in Gaza, the New York Times reported on Monday. The Times report said that Israeli officials referred to U.S. and allied bombings campaigns of Germany and Japan during World War II that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The reference included the U.S. fire bombings of Japanese cities, which killed around 100,000 civilians in Tokyo in one night in 1945, as well as the bombings of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I've also heard that, there was ties made to Dresden and the bombing campaign there in Germany as well. Israel's plan for mass slaughter in Gaza and the growing child death toll have not impacted U.S. support. The Times report focused on how the administration is paying lip service to the idea of limiting civilian casualties, but they acknowledge that they're not telling Israel what to do, only asking questions. And so imagine, privately, you're being told by somebody, hey, I'm going to commit atrocities. Like, I am going to kill all these people. And publicly you're saying, like, look, yes, I'm giving him the guns if he wants to kill people, but I'm asking him not to kill people. Obviously, that's stupid that you're enabling the crime if somebody is telling you they're going to commit a crime and then you give them weapons to do so. So, that's the situation there. They're also really trying to wash the casualties in these horrific crimes and saying, oh, we're giving them a little bit of aid too. So we'll give $10 billion of weapons to Israel and $100 million of aid to Palestine, and then pretend like, see, we're helping the civilians, aren't we? Not more civilians are going to die under our bombs and actually be fed by that aid that's going to be provided. All right, so at least 50 killed by an Israeli strike on a refugee camp in Gaza. Israeli warplanes on Tuesday hammered a refugee camp in northern Gaza with airstrikes, killing at least 50 people. Of course, about 80% of the 2.3 million people that live in Gaza are refugees and do live in refugee camps. Very few of the people who actually live in Gaza are from the Gaza Strip. They're from other areas of Palestine, and they had been previously displaced in Israeli, military campaigns and other pogroms to move them from what is now Israel. So the Israeli military has acknowledged it launched airstrikes, claiming a senior Hamas commander was in the civilian populated camp. For their part, Hamas denied one of its commanders was in the camp. Gaza's interior minister said the strikes were launched with the U.S.-made bombs. These buildings house hundreds of civilians, and the occupation's Air Force destroyed the district with 6 U.S.-made bombs. It is the latest massacre caused by the Israeli aggression on the Gaza Strip, the interior minister spokesperson said, according to Middle East Eye. Gaza's Indonesian hospital confirmed that more than 50 were killed in the strike. According to Middle East Eye, Gaza's health ministry said that at least 100 were killed. The Interior Ministry touted said the total casualties were around 400, including both dead and wounded. Photos of the aftermath show craters and rubble from the destroyed and damaged buildings. CNN host Wolf Blitzer asked an Israeli military spokesperson if Israel was aware of the refugee camp was full of innocent civilians, men, women, and children, and the spokesperson responded, "This is a tragedy of war, Wolf. We've been saying for days, move south." So he's basically saying that because civilians were there, they deserve to die in the Israeli bombing campaign, and they don't have any role, I guess, in, they see it in not killing civilians if they feel like there's somebody there that should be taken out. So next up here, U.S. Special Operations Forces are inside of Israel helping to locate hostages. American Special Operation Forces are in the ground inside of Israel helping to locate hostages Hamas has brought into Gaza after the October 7th attack on southern Israel, a Pentagon official said on Tuesday. We're actively helping the Israelis do a number of things, said Christopher P. Mayer, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations, according to the New York Times. He said the main task was to identify hostages, including American hostages. Mayer did not say how many U.S. commandos were in Israel, but U.S. officials told the Times that several dozen had been deployed in addition to a small team that was already inside of Israel on October 7th. Shortly after the Hamas attack, the Pentagon offered Israel special operations support. The Times did not say that the U.S. commandos were not assigned to combat roles, and so far there is no indication that U.S. troops are in the ground inside of Gaza as Israeli forces are pushing further into the enclave. And I would kind of believe that, at least as of now, Israel feels like they have the forces that they need to carry out these operations, and that if American forces are involved, there might be a slightly higher standard as to how they conduct themselves on the ground. And so I would guess that Tel Aviv would prefer that the Americans not be involved unless they need them involved. So at some point it may become clear that the Americans, for whatever reason, would be efficient fighters for a particular operation. Maybe then they would be called upon. But my guess is Israel would prefer not to have the Americans involved if possible. You know, they want our money, our support, our weapons, things like that, but not necessarily full American involvement in this war. You know, it's still going to be an Israeli conflict. Now, if Hamas starts carrying out attacks in the north or something like that, I think, again, it changes the tune. But just for the Gaza operation, the ethnic cleansing campaign, I think that Americans may bear witness and cause problems for Israel versus actually present assets at this point. All right, so U.S. Israel considered deploying multinational force to Gaza after the war. The U.S. and Israel are considering establishing a multinational force to occupy the Gaza Strip if Israel successfully eliminates Hamas, Bloomberg reported on Tuesday. The idea would be to grant temporary oversight of Gaza to countries in the region backed by a force with troops from the U.S., Britain, France, and Germany. Sources told Bloomberg that ideally the force would also include Arab nations such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE. I cannot imagine this working or going through, but it's very interesting that it's even being considered. I mean, President Biden ran on getting the U.S. out of the Mideast, and this would probably entrench the Americans there more than almost anything else. And don't forget, like, you know, the last time the U.S. tried to do something like this in southern Lebanon, of course, it got a lot of U.S. Marines killed. All right, so last article here today, report Netanyahu lobbied European Union to pressure Egypt to accept refugees from Gaza. So the Israeli Prime Minister lobbied European leaders to pressure Egypt into allowing Palestinian refugees into its territory from Gaza, according to the Financial Times report on Monday. The report, which cited people familiar with the talks, said the discussions happened last week, but key European countries, including Britain, France, and Germany, dismissed the idea as unrealistic due to Egypt's stated opposition to absorbing the Palestinians. And look, I made this point a lot. I really hate this solution. I think it's long-term horrific for the Palestinians. They're just going to be a displaced people in the Sinai. My guess is over time there's less and less help for them, and eventually, they just kind of the community will have to wither away. A lot of them will become Egyptians, others will move to other countries, but this is essentially a way to slow down and dress up the ethnic cleansing campaign against the Palestinians, but that's really all that is. So good to see that this isn't going to happen. Of course, I would like, for there to be I guess, more crossings out of Gaza for the people that feel like they absolutely have to leave and want to leave, ambulances, things like that. For the most part, the border crossing to between Gaza and Egypt has been closed a lot of the times due to Israeli bombing or Israeli demands. But I believe that opened up this morning, and some dual citizens, Gaza and another country, were allowed to leave, as well as a few ambulances. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up the show today. Thank you so much for tuning in. I will be back with another episode on Friday.